I feel I kind of need no further introduction. So yes, just to explain, I have this dual role as a trainer on the initial educational psychology training programme, as well as a practitioner role as well. And more about that later. So a little bit about the educational psychology profession within the UK. It's relatively small. There's only about 3,000 of us, so very quickly you get to know who's who, and yes, certainly in terms of conferences, you always seem to be meeting somebody that knows somebody else that you know, which is really nice. The pattern really of practice has changed quite radically, I would say, over the last decade. It's still the case that most educational psychologists are employed by local authorities. But what has happened, certainly since the coalition government came to power in 2009, is that increasingly funding has been delegated to schools rather than to local authorities. So whereby in previous years, educational psychology services were really quite centralised, and schools would, for example, have a pot of time really, which came out of a sort of centralised fund. Now services are traded increasingly, so schools buy in time from educational psychologists, and that would depend on the school's perceived need, how they would want to use the educational psychologist. And also they're at liberty to buy in psychologist time not only from local authority educational psychologists but from private practitioners, and increasingly we're also seeing more educational psychologists employed either directly by schools or by clusters of schools or through social enterprise initiatives. So really quite a sort of a fluid pattern really, and things are still changing. So what do we do as educational psychologists? One thing to say is it says there about children and young people's needs, and reference are made to children and young people. One interesting recent development in relation to the role of the educational psychologist has arisen from the Children and Families Bill, the 2014 bill, extending statutory provision within education, health and care plans right up to 25 for young people who have special educational needs and disabilities. So increasingly educational psychologists are finding themselves working with the older age range and young adults. So that's something that we've really had to think about, our response as a profession to meeting the needs of older young people. So in terms of a practitioner role, I guess it could be simplified into two main functions. The first of which is providing expert assessment of children and young people's needs, and to link this to educational provision and placement. Let's just unpick that a little bit in terms of, first of all, what assessment might look like. So it may be something like cognitive profiling or educational assessment, but actually the assessment repertoire of educational psychologists is really quite wide-ranging, so into things like mental health and well-being, family relations, social status and social relationships of children, social communication difficulties, and it will be very much motor skills, and it will be very much determined by the kind of hypotheses generated around the needs of that particular child or that particular context. And also linking that to educational provision and placement. So again, just to unpick that a little bit, a lot of people understand the educational psychologist's role in relation to the kind of statutory functions, so provision of statements and doing assessment in relation to where a child's needs in terms of inclusion, learning, well-being may be best met. But actually, that's a very kind of wide level. More often than not, educational psychologists are looking at how things can be adjusted within mainstream to take account of the children's needs, their strengths and their difficulties, and how the provision can be tweaked and reviewed in order to give the child the best opportunities within their current school. And the other main element of EP's work is in terms of supporting young people in ways which helps to address their needs and improve outcomes for them. So again, that's very multifaceted, and it goes, way beyond individual intervention to group work, to systemic work, to working with adults, parents, teachers, other professionals that are supporting children and young people in order to think about how outcomes can be improved. And certainly that's something that under the new Code of Practice, the Educational Needs Code of Special Educational Needs Code of Practice, is something that's very paramount and central to that document, that idea that not only are we focused on outcomes, but also thinking about how we can elicit the young person's voice in thinking about what outcomes are important for them. So there's been a number of studies which have referred to the core functions of educational psychologists, of which there are 5 listed there, and these functions occur at 3 different levels. So with the individual child, when working with groups of children, and also systemic work at an organisational level. And what I'm going to do for most of the rest of my slot is to give you an anonymised case example, which hopefully will give you some idea about what those different functions might look like in relation to authentic casework. So this is Riley. Riley is a 9-year-old boy who attends a very supportive mainstream school in a socially disadvantaged area of a big city. Riley is currently on his second foster care placement. He was accommodated by the local authority about 3 years ago, and unfortunately his first foster care placement broke down, and the main reason for that was to do with aggression, physical aggression towards his foster carers and his foster siblings. And what's the sort of priority concerns at school are really relate to emotional regulation, so controlling his emotions within school, his level of activity, and also his ability to really access the curriculum, an age-appropriate curriculum, given that he's 9. So the first function is consultation, and one of the things that I've done as part of this piece of casework is really to have to really identify the adults that are supporting Riley, and there are a number of adults working with him, and to really start to have problem-solving, solution-focused, collaborative conversations about how his needs might be met, and also to think about who's doing what, given that so many people are working with him. So there's a social worker and a family placement social worker involved. There are also his relatively new foster carers. There's the teacher and support staff at school, and also he has involvement from the Child and Adolescent Mental Health Service. So I'm liaising with the clinical psychologist in terms of a kind of division of labour who's doing what in terms of supporting Riley's needs. So those conversations are ongoing. Now they do have an assessment function, because obviously through having that collaborative reviewing and ongoing discussions about how things are, we also spot new things about what can be tricky for Riley, and also what can be supportive. So in terms of assessment, we have done some sort of I've done some cognitive assessment, some cognitive profiling, and what that reveals is that Riley has some real strengths. So his language is a strength, and to some extent his visual reasoning is a strength, but he does have difficulty with working memory and attention, and to some extent that mirrors really what we see through observations, that he finds it difficult to sit still, he finds it difficult to follow instructions and to manage his attention for prolonged periods in class. And also when he becomes emotionally aroused, that often plays out as quite an angry response, both in the classroom and the playground. And although he has some strategies for managing that, things like a timeout card, he's not always able to kind of operationalise those in the moment. Then his emotional arousal sort of happens too quickly, and before he knows it, he finds himself struggling to actually kind of think rationally and to employ those strategies. We've also done some achievement assessments. So what we found there is given some of the strengths he has, reading is something that he finds extremely difficult, to such an extent that the written aspects of the curriculum, of which there are lots as a Year 4 pupil, are a real sort of barrier to his learning. He finds that extremely difficult. The strengths are that he's an articulate boy, he has a lovely sense of humour, and then actually when he has some adult support, either individually or within a small group, he can work extremely well. So that tells us a lot about the sorts of things that would potentially be useful to Riley. Intervention, I mean, potentially there could be a role to do individual therapeutic work. In this case, he's already getting some of that at CAM, so it's more about kind of support for the adults involved with Riley, to some extent the school staff, but also his foster carers. So some therapeutic work, some time for them to really talk about how they're finding things, and to sort of offload a little bit, but also some work on parenting skills and strategies. I'll say a little bit more about the whole class work to promote social inclusion when I come to talk about the research. But the other thing that we looked at was, given his difficulties with literacy, to try and do something really positive around that, which also helped him to develop social relationships with some of his peers. So we did some story work, and I was able to kind of record and publish some of the stories that he did, so that actually his verbal strengths were reflected in some of the story writing, whereas the burden of recording was taken away, and I was able to take that on. So we haven't done any training in this instance. It's not been something that school have prioritised because they've been more interested in the research, but potentially the sort of training that might happen, aside from, I suppose you could argue that the work with the parents is related to sort of skills acquisition. But it might be that the school at some point will think that it'd be useful to widen the staff knowledge of things like supporting children with attentional difficulties in the classroom, something about maybe attachment in schools, or something like precision teaching, again, is a useful strategy potentially for supporting Riley in thinking about how to really accelerate his literacy acquisition given the gaps that he currently has. Okay, so just to say a little bit about research. So I mentioned that we tried to look at a project to really promote Riley's social inclusion. The thing that the special educational needs coordinator and I found was potentially the most useful intervention was Playground Pals. You can see here, it's not a well-defined strategy, and it tends to be kind of resource-led. So it's really about kind of the identification of self-selected children as helpers, and they get to wear a sort of tabard and a hat, and then their role within playtimes is to really engage and involve children that might be socially isolated. So there wasn't really any empirical evidence which suggested whether this sort of intervention was effective. So we were able to use the intervention as an opportunity to gather some data which potentially then could inform whether or not it was going to be something that would be useful to extend to other schools. So one of the things that I did was some scoping. I looked at how another Playground Pal scheme was running at a neighbouring school. We then did some questionnaires and focus groups with the children across all age groups, but also some interviews and focus groups with adults that were involved in supporting playtimes with teachers, parents, and also with the lunchtime organisers. And once we'd kind of understood what the priority concerns were and understood what children wanted from playtimes, we were able to implement some different approaches, things like having a bus stop where children who might not have any friends to play with could wait, to have more playground equipment, to have more structured activities, and ultimately to kind of review that, and also to make a video with the children about how that had worked, which we were able then to disseminate to other schools and to other educational psychologists. Just very briefly, a little bit about the training route. It is a 3-year doctoral programme, and there's a research component and a practitioner component. So there's academic and professional practice, typically within local authorities, but some of our trainees go and work with private providers or within social enterprise initiatives, and that's across all 3 years, typically in more than one setting. There's teaching of applied psychology across all 3 years, and roughly about 300 days placement, and the research is tied in with those placement days. It's centrally funded by the Department for Education via the National College for Teaching and Leadership, and there are 12 training centres in England. If people are interested, it's relatively competitive, so it's useful to go and think about kind of experiences that would assist in developing experience with working with children. And the other thing I'd say is lots of people come on the programme with educational experiences, but what we're really looking for is people thinking as psychologists and applying psychology within schools and educational settings. So thank you very much, and obviously if anyone's got any questions at the end, we'll come to that then. Thank you.